I think I always internalize a sense of like, you just keep your head down. That's part of what it is. Practicing or not, you just kind of keep your head down. And something that I've learned from Jeannie, not just in this context, but in many contexts over the years, is that no, sometimes you have to stick your head out and stand up and just sort of be, not like take it all on, but just like live it as you want to live in a way that is you're proud of and that is in fact public.
Welcome to this episode of Your People Will Be My People, Conversion in a Post-October 7th World. Sponsored by Project Ruth. Project Ruth was founded in 2023 to formalize Orthodox affiliation for Jews of diverse and varied backgrounds, and welcome those seeking Orthodox conversion to find meaningful connection to and understanding of Jewish life and practice. I am Rabbi Minz, founder and president of Project Ruth. I'm joined by my partner in these podcasts, Meredith Berkman, community activist and leader within the Jewish community. This morning, we are joined by Jacob Gersen. Jacob is the Sidley Austin Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and affiliate professor in the Department of Government and director of the Food Law Lab, which supports academic research on the legal treatment of food in society. And Jacob, that in itself, I'm sure, is worthy of an amazing of an amazing podcast. But for now, what we want to focus on is the fact that Jacob is married to Professor Jeannie Suk Gersen, who actually was our first guest on these Project Ruth podcasts. Jeannie converted with Project Ruth and wrote about her experience in The New Yorker. And as Jacob, you said when I asked you whether you would join us on the podcast, now I'll be able to tell my side of the story. So here we are. We're not The New Yorker, but Jacob, take it away. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be here with you both.
Why don't you just give us a little bit of your own background, and then we'll kind of fit Jeannie in there.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Maine, actually. My family is all from New York. My mother and father both grew up on Long Island in the Syosset Jericho area. One half of the family is from the Bronx.
That Long Island? If they grew up
Long
in that
Island.
part,
Like I said, I was born and raised in Maine, so I don't speak that way. So one half of the family is from the Bronx, the other from Brooklyn, and my parents were raised there. They went to Harper College in those days. It's now SUNY Binghamton. And they got really close to graduation. And then, of course, because of the time it was, they dropped out a semester away. They moved to Manhattan. My dad drove a cab for a long time, or some period of time. He was not very good at it, apparently. They kept a dog, a big dog, whose name was Big Dog, unsurprisingly. And then at some point, they decided to get out of town. And so they checked out. They had some friends who had a big plot of land up in Maine, and they just picked up and moved up there. They helped build a house. They kind of lived that back to the land lifestyle. My dad kept bees. Someone would bring milk around from the local farm. And it was very much a kind of back to the land, back to nature time in life for them. And so that's where I was born. When it was time to go to school, so to speak, they moved in town, as it were. And so I grew up mostly in Auburn, Maine, Lewis and Auburn, the greater LA area, as they call it there, where my daughter is now in college at Bates. And so she actually volunteers at the same middle school I went to, Auburn Middle School. And that was a town that at the time was mostly French Canadian Catholic. It was a pretty conservative, pretty white town. There was a Jewish community that was small but existent. There were at least, obviously, 2 synagogues.
Wait. You mean the one you go to, the famous, the one you go to and the one you wouldn't step foot in? As per Shecky Green et al. Okay, got it.
Indeed. But there were, in fact, 2 of them. And I always thought of it as a very small community, but if I look back and think about it, actually the room was pretty full on high holidays. It was a non-trivial congregation. So that was a conservative shul we went to. I grew up conservative, not especially observant, Hebrew school, high holidays, Passover.
Bar mitzvah?
Bar mitzvah, absolutely. And that was meaningful. And religion was part of the family, but not, I would say, deeply interwoven into it at a certain point. My father's parents were deeply culturally Jewish, like deeply culturally Jewish. Everything was Yiddish. They grew up in the Coops. My grandfather was a member of an all clarinet klezmer band. And that was pretty much all they talked about. But they really had, I think, deep, I could say ambivalence, but I think it was really more hostility towards the religious aspect of Judaism. And so that was internalized by everyone. My mother's family was not especially religious. They identified as Jews, but, also probably had a Christmas tree, I would say, some years. And so when my parents married and were raising us, they kind of had to find their own way through it. And so they knew they wanted to raise us as Jews, and we existed as Jews in that town. But I think had to figure out exactly how to embrace and walk with Judaism at that point.
And how did it feel? So how did it feel for you? You've told us about your parents, but you said the room was full, you were identified. Um, but how did you feel about it as as an adolescent, as a young adult, then as an adult, because you want to get to the part where you met your beshert, your wonderful wife. So how did it feel to you to be Jewish?
I think that it felt to say, I think at one point in one of our earlier conversations with Rabbi, I said, like, I always felt like a little bit on the outside, like an outsider, I had existed. I had lots of friends. I was on the end, but always I felt that. And he said, yeah, that's because you're Jewish. And it was like it was the first time in my life someone had said that. And I thought, oh, right. And that kind of made sense.
Did your parents care whether you continue that Judaism as an adult?
I think that my mother did. And if I'm honest, my father had a deeply ambivalent relationship to Judaism. He had a brother who died fairly young in his early 20s. And, and my father has since passed away, but I think my father never quite forgave God for that, if I'm honest. And so I remember vividly being in shul on the high holidays and my father kind of muttering under his breath. And it was just too kind of cute. So I think he was ambivalent about it. He had internalized that ambivalence from his own parents. And so I think it was important to him, but it wasn't like we were taught it was important, so to speak.
Now, what happened? You went away for school. You got to college. You decided to go away. Was that a big decision? I mean, you didn't go so far, but you went away.
Yeah, I had a sense that I needed to leave home or leave that town. And so I did. I went to Brown University for my undergraduate work, which was a great place. I studied religious studies. So, had lots of religious.
Jacob Neusner. You were there in the era of Neusner, weren't you?
It was a good era.
He was always writing a book. You know the joke.
The Berkmans / Mintzes, their Mintzes, are a Brown family.
Right, but the joke about Professor Neusner, who I would suspect was a mentor of yours in that work, right?
You might suspect that, but I think in the interest of candor, I should say no. I never stepped foot in Hillel at Brown, and all my religious interests were really Eastern religion. I studied Taoism and Buddhism with a wonderful man there at the time, and it was a way, I think, of exploring my religious interests and meaning, but in a way that still kept my own religious identity at a distance. And so I was not really ready. I was there, but I was not a community I wanted to be a part of at the time, if I'm honest. And it's not something I'm proud of. I kind of regret it in some ways, but I can't rewrite that history. Like, I wasn't really a part of the Jewish community at Brown.
And what about in law school?
In law school, so after Brown, I went to the University of Chicago for graduate school. I did a PhD in political science there, and then in law school.
Did you know you wanted to be a lawyer or a professor from the beginning?
I knew I wanted to be a professor from the beginning. And then about 3 years into graduate school, which I just love, it's just an amazing time. You get up, and if you have enough money to live, you write on whatever you want to until you get bored, and then you do something else. It was great. And at the time, I was just not totally captivated by mainstream political science. I liked it, but I didn't love it. And the things I was most interested in were more legal in nature. And so I had a great teacher and mentor at the time who was in both departments, and I moved over. And so I went to law school knowing I really wanted to teach, but also knowing that might not work out, that that's a very hard path. I might have been really awful at law school. It might have been hard to get a job. And I thought I could be a lawyer in lots of different ways, and that would be fine. But yeah, what I wanted to do was teach. I tried to kind of keep that to myself for the most part, but that's what I wanted to do. And I got very lucky that it worked out, and I just have the best job in the world for me. And as for the Jewish community there, I was a part of it, but not an integral part of it, I would say. And I had been married before being married to Jeannie. And actually, at the time, I realized this morning. I had reached out to the rabbi at Brown at the time. This was after I had left, about doing the ceremony. And I have to say, I was just not lovely, woefully naive in some sense, because I reached out to him. My first wife was not Jewish. And I reached out to him thinking he would perform this ceremony. And of course, there was no chance of him performing that ceremony. And how I could have not had that recognition, I don't know, but I actually didn't. And so I experienced some of the rejection at that time. And I thought, okay, if you don't want to be a part of my life, I don't want to be a part of yours either.
But it was unexpected from your perspective.
Yeah, and it should not have been. That's a crazy thing not to expect. Obviously, that should have been expected. But I think it speaks to my own relation to Judaism at the time. There weren't a lot of Jewish women where I grew up. There were some, but not that many.
Did your mother care that you were marrying a non-Jew?
A little bit.
Did your grandparents are still alive?
They were still alive.
And was that an issue in their home?
It was not. They cared, but it was not an issue, I would say. So there was none of the you have to, you can't do this, yada yada yada, over our dead body. It was none of that, but it mattered to them.
And did your first wife? I apologize because I don't.
Not at all.
Adam knows you much better than I, obviously. Did you? And then, was it an issue for your first wife that she was marrying a Jew? And then who married you?
A judge married us, who was a friend, who was a wonderful, wonderful judge in Maine. She is now a former state Supreme Court justice in Maine. Just a terrific judge and justice who I love and respect a lot. And so we decided not to have a religious officiant on either side. She came from, I would say, a quite religious family in Virginia. And it must at some level been difficult for them, to be honest with you. But they were never anything other than totally welcoming to me.
And Judaism, religion didn't play a role in your home. It didn't matter that you were Jewish, or it did.
I think it as happens occasionally or sometimes, when it's time to get married and have kids, you have to come to terms with it. So you can kind of fudge it for a while, depending on how you grew up. But at that point, you have to come to terms with it. And so I think that I actually assumed we would raise the kids Jewish, and I haven't asked her, but my guess is my ex-wife assumed we would not.
And you did not have children together, or you did have children?
We did have children. We have 2 children together. Both were bat mitzvahed. We have 2 girls. And in my mind, there was no question that would happen, but I bet in hers there probably was.
And were they raised with both? Were they raised as culturally Jewish? Were they raised as unaffiliated?
They were raised with both.
I want to get to the good stuff about you and Jeannie, obviously.
Done. Yeah, they were raised with both, I would say. And so I think for several years, they would have identified as both Jewish and not Jewish or Christian. And today, I'm not sure. I know how I think of them, but I won't speak for them.
Okay. And then you moved to Cambridge, you moved to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And then you met Jeannie.
Yes. I moved to Harvard in 2011. Got divorced at some point, met Jeannie, fell deeply in love, and here we are, more than a decade later. Yeah.
Now, was Jeannie's? I know Jeannie was the most Jewish, non-Jewish person in the world when you met her. We know that for sure. But was religion an issue with Jeannie?
It was not. Let's see. That's a good question. Was religion an issue with Jeannie? I would say mostly no. I was surprised by how Jewish Jeannie was.
Well, let's just tell everybody who doesn't know. Jeannie's first husband was Jewish, so she was actually following in something that she had done previously.
Absolutely. So, they lived a a pretty observant life, I would say, even though she was not Jewish. And so had, I think, built the rituals built into her daily life and months of the year in a way that I had not. We were like, not exactly, but close to like Christmas, Easter Jews, Passover, high holidays, Hanukkah, and totally identified as Jewish, no question asked. But I think like, we're not observant in that way. And so Jeannie was really more observant and had been in her past life. And I think, after she and her Noah separated or got divorced, had to decide how to live and how she wanted to live. And I think there was sort of choice at that point for the first time, because that had to be negotiated in the context of the first marriage and his family, obviously. But yeah, she had like a deep familiarity and I think really love and appreciation for the traditions.
Did you incorporate in the early years with Jeannie and the kids? Did you incorporate some of those traditions?
Yeah, we did, and it was really like a source of meaning and positive, interaction. Like that was great, but it was also weird because, like, the non-Jew is sort of leading the service, so to speak. Whether it's an actual service or not, with a sort of greater depth of knowledge in some cases and familiarity in a way that was like, it was great, but odd.
But did you resent it at all? Because, you've said you were not feeling so deeply connected. And now you've met this beautiful, brilliant woman that you're starting a new married life with, and she's into it. But, so you said you enjoyed it, and it was weird, but did you resent it at all? Because that wasn't a choice that you had really ever made based on what you've told us in your own life.
Yeah, I don't think I resented it. I think I felt a sense of almost guilt or like inadequacy is how I would describe it. Like, wow, I actually don't know this prayer as I should, or I don't know the intricacies of this particular tradition or holiday as I should. Embarrassed is too strong, but I think there was something like embarrassment in it. And so like there wasn't resentment about doing it. It was good. But I think there was a sense of like, this isn't like, I'm not showing up as much as I might like here, if that makes sense.
So for those who didn't hear, and they should go back and listen to the podcast with Jeannie, and certainly should go back and read that story, because I feel like that's a classic New Yorker piece that many people will return to for years to come, that'll be passed along, when people are thinking about conversion. So it was so well done. Can you take us back to what was the impetus for her conversion at that point, and what point it was in your marriage, and then how you felt about that?
Yeah. So I think conversion was something that she had thought about a lot over the years, had never done it. And in our life was something that we had talked about. It wasn't, I think she had asked, whether it was something that I would want. And I thought seriously about it. And I said, yes, I think that would be nice to be together in. But it wasn't something that I like demanded or that we had to do for some, parental reason or family reason. And so we talked about it for several years, really, trying to figure out the right way to do it for her. And I think her relationship to Judaism was really quite strongly, in association to Orthodox Judaism. That was the family that she had been a part of and the traditions that she had learned. And I think the affection that she had. And we weren't sure that was going to be possible to do a conversion that way. And she didn't really have a connection to the conservative movement, and the reform, was different. We had some connections there. So I think figuring out the right thing to do that felt right was hard. It just took a long time. And there was never like a reason, like we have to get it done by December 2nd. And so we just kept talking about it. And it became clear that it was something that she really wanted to do. And then kind of like my memory is like, it was kind of like a lightning strike. Like, well, I know like I just can't do it the way I want to do it. So we'll have to find some other like, not quite as good thing, I just can't. And then we found Rabbi Minz, and that really changed Jeannie's life, I think, and our family life. And so it's something we're enormously grateful for. And that process of working with him through her conversion, I think, brought me closer to Judaism, and the two of us closer together. and has really just, changed life in a pretty fundamental way. And so I feel, and I think Jeannie does too, enormously grateful and lucky. Not all of that process was easy or like perfect or smooth, but it's been a great, wonderful thing for us. And
How
I
did you
feel,
participate? I mean, do you feel almost like, you almost quote converted or quasi converted yourself? I mean, obviously you're halakhically Jewish, you're born Jewish, but you weren't engaged. You maybe you didn't feel Jewish, but you knew you were Jewish and you respected. You said your daughters from your first marriage became, b'nai mitzvot. But how much did you I mean, and Adam, of course, you're the ringer because you know the answer because you did the conversion. How much did you sort of participate in the conversion? Did it feel almost like, not literally, but like a family conversion, a couple's conversion? Like how did you participate in it? And you're very grateful for it. Maybe you could just put a little more meat on those bones of what you actually got from it or what it meant to you, or like the moment that you realized, wow, I feel differently about myself as a Jew, which is what I think you were saying.
yeah. So I think in terms of process and participation, like my memory is of being kind of there and off to the side. And so I was there for a lot of the weekly meetings, but didn't speak very much. I really wanted Jeannie to be the person this was for. So I didn't want to kind of crowd her space, so to speak. And so tried to be there, but not take over in any way or make it our conversion, because it wasn't that. It was something that she was doing. It affected our life, but this was her process and her conversion. I wanted to be there with her to the extent possible and appropriate and support her, but not kind of take it over and make it something different. And I think that sometimes, she and Rabbi Minz have a special relationship. I think, it means a lot. And I just didn't want to crowd in, so to speak, on it. That said, I think like I was there and we talked and did a lot of weekly study, and in talking through a lot of the issues around it, I definitely learned a lot. And I think like thinking about, parsha each week that's different than I did. And that was really a wonderful thing to be able to do. It's hard, as you may gather, to get a word in edgewise when the two of them are, on a line, but I worked on it. And as for like for me in Judaism, like, obviously we're like, observing in a different way than I was historically. That's mostly really nice. It's a change because I hadn't lived that way. And I never thought of myself as not a Jew. And in part, it's because like no one or everyone around me always thought of me as a Jew. And, it was like where I grew up, like that was just the insult you would hurl. It wasn't like especially bad. It was like calling someone a jerk, you Jew. That's just like, that was just what it was. It was part of the community. And so there was no chance of like, I wasn't going to feel or be Jewish. The question is like, in what way was I going to be Jewish, and how was I going to practice, and what did that mean for my existence or my identity? And I think, the truth is that for folks who were not raised Orthodox, and like there was no chance that I was, where I grew up, there was no Orthodox. I was not going to be raised Orthodox. I think there's sometimes an internalization of a sense that like you're not real Jews, that the Orthodox don't think you're real Jews. And I think I carried a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that, to be fair. And so that was something that I had to grapple with a little bit.
We have to tell everybody, you have a unique situation because your non-Jewish wife, the not Jewish that she was Orthodox. That's very rare, meaning that her association with Judaism, even though she herself had never converted, was Orthodox Judaism. So the Judaism she was practicing as a quasi-outsider was Orthodox Judaism. I mean, we joke about this all the time. So she was Orthodox, but she forgot to be Jewish. That Jacob, is something you never find. So you're describing being on the outside because you would have a family meal, in theory also with Noah, and Orthodoxy was being practiced around the meal, around the table, even though Jeannie wasn't Jewish yet.
Right. So I was
no one else has that. You can write your New Yorker article because no one else in history has ever had that situation.
So that was a sort of weird posture to it all, or position to it all. It was interesting, but I was like, I think I almost, I was less Jewish than the non-Jew is one way to put it. And so the judgment about not being Jewish was not that Jeannie was doing this, but, like just structurally was almost as though it was like coming from a non-Jew too. And so that was especially weird.
Now, what about how did your daughters deal with these interim years? And I mean, they were younger then. So was it hard for them?
I think it was, a blended family is always challenging. And, we had plenty of challenges along those lines. I think the religious practice was one of them, but I wouldn't rank it at the top, I would say. So I think that they were comfortable. I think my daughters were largely comfortable, like going to church when they went to church and going to synagogue when that's synagogue and dressing up for Purim and, like Passover. Like it just seemed not flawless, but natural to go back and forth, maybe because they were existing as going back and forth between two households. So going back and forth between these two different aspects of identity was not like as terrible. That's my sense of it.
They have an opinion when Jeannie / and you were going through the conversion process?
They had various opinions. I think overall they were supportive. There was a little bit of like, why do you have to do this? You can practice however you want to practice. Why do you have to convert? And we talked about that and explained it, our sense of it. I think that was a manifestation of just a core anxiety about change. Does it mean that like my parents will be different, that our lives will be different? Like, is it the same person who's converting, or is it like becoming a different person in some sense? Will I lose my mother or will I lose my father through this process? And though it wasn't articulated that way, I think that's sort of the core fear. What does it mean to convert? Like, how much change is it exactly? And from a child's perspective, watching a parent go through that, that's scary.
Were you afraid that Jeannie was going to change? That you had, like you said, a blended family, a second marriage, all the complications, and now all of a sudden you were throwing in a new twist to it, that Jeannie now was converting.
I didn't have that anxiety at first, and did I have it later? I didn't really. Like, I think I should have been more attuned to how our life would change, whether that would be difficult. But I wasn't early on. And I know it sounds kind of silly or even banal, but it felt more like a confirmation or affirmation than a transformation. She had lived like, kind of an Orthodox life for a long time, like as a part of an Orthodox family in any sense. And we ourselves were, I don't know, practicing in particular ways. So it just didn't seem like a radical transformation. It seemed like part of her that was finally able to come out and come to light fully and be fully realized, as opposed to this complete transformation, even though, of course, in some ways it is.
Were you ever concerned or worried that by choosing to have an Orthodox conversion, you would be not forced? I mean, you were in a loving, yeah, obviously, she's your wife and you love her, but that you would be tacitly pressured to live a much more religious life than you had ever wanted or could have foreseen. I mean, you fell in love with her, and she was, though she wasn't halakhically Jewish, she wasn't Jewish at that point, but she was living a more Orthodox life. But then by, getting the hechsher, were you worried because she's getting an Orthodox conversion and that wasn't something you had longed for in your life? So were you worried about that?
I was worried about that, to be honest. And I think it's a reasonable thing to worry about. Because I think that, but yeah, of course we all choose, but you want to live life together. That's part of the reason that this was meaningful. And so I had some anxiety about that, I think. I think there's a kind of pitfall for the relationships as you talk about conversion and partners and spouses. And so occasionally I've observed that, even like, why do I keep kosher? Why do I observe Sabbath? Why, there's a sense in which, like, for the person who like didn't grow up doing that, like me, that the reason you're doing it or I'm doing it isn't for my religion, but for my wife. And that's okay. That's a good reason to do things, to make your wife happy and your family happy. But of course, if it's something that like you didn't want to do for a long time, it could also be a source of resentment. And suddenly you don't resent the rabbi, That's a crazy rule, Rabbi. You could start to resent the partner, whether it's a husband or a wife. So I think that's something that just has to be managed, but it's important to see as a pitfall along the path, as it were.
So how do you manage that? I would love to know maybe if you feel comfortable sharing an example, because I think
Yeah, that was gonna be my question. What was the hardest change for you, for Jeannie, for both of you, for your blended family?
yeah, Adam talks tachlis. I'm just circling around. Thank you, Adam.
I think that the hardest part was this, this pocket of things we're talking about, and it's both sides of it. So, for example, if we're going to go to shul on on Saturday, but one person thinks the other person doesn't really want to go to shul on Saturday, so they feel like they have to drag the person to shul on Saturday, and so then you're at shul, and someone says "Oh, you're the one who has to be dragged here, right?" There's all those dynamics which are not unique to conversion, but I think are particular.
By the way, that's not only for, both my husband and that's not, it's interesting in that case. Yes, it's about conversion, but that can be but anyway, sorry.
Of course, it's absolutely, that happens all the time, conversion or non-conversion, 100%. But there's a particular dynamic in the conversion, I think. And so it's just a particular variant of that general problem. That's all. So I think for me, at least, it's good to remind myself that this is a choice, and B, that it's part of weaving together things into our life, as opposed to one person wanting to do it, another person compromising and not. That's just not what it is, ideally. And so it's not that those emotions never arise, but I can just see them. Oh, that's happening. That's not a good idea. Actually, this is a really wonderful thing, not something to be upset about. And I think it has to do not just with the discrete aspects, but also with the relation to Judaism in particular. So, we go mostly to Orthodox, services, shul, and that is the community has been incredibly welcoming to us, and I think is genuinely happy we're there. Genuinely happy we're there, but it's also not a community that I grew up in. Sitting there, there's both a kind of familiarity to it, of course, and a sense of alienation, because there's familiarity, but not complete knowledge. And the folks who grew up in it, they know everything, they know everyone. It's a kind of common language or experience that's being repeated. And for someone stepping into it, even though it's really welcoming, there's an experience of going and doing this thing together, which is a wonderful thing to do together, but still kind of feeling like an outsider in it. And that circles back to this thing I said before.
Yeah, so let me just say two things. Number one is that in my shul this Shabbos, and obviously we're now attracting my conversion candidates and my converts, we're now actually introducing a buddy system, exactly for the reason you said, Jacob, and that is that the newcomers, they feel alienated. Even if they can follow the service, they just feel as if it's not home. But be able to sit next to someone, and maybe you want to talk to them about football, and maybe you want to talk to them about the Torah reading, but there's someone to talk to and to share with makes a huge difference. And again, Jacob, like you said, it's the same thing, because what you need to say is Jeannie grew up in the Harvard Hillel. That's the weird thing. Means she went back now to her shul that she was very much part of, even though she wasn't Jewish. So Jeannie's going home and you're finding a new home. That must be especially tricky.
I think it is. Yeah. It's, I think it creates lots of opportunities, because it's, she's an insider outsider coming home, and I'm also a kind of outsider insider coming. And that sense of crossing a border to get back home. And, I think of my stories, it is kind of just leaving home and trying to come back story, as most of our stories are. We're trying to figure out what the home is. I think that we just have both a really similar experience, because we're not true insiders, and this slight gap in it, which I think if we can talk about, we can both learn from. And so, I mean, sincerely, I'm totally appreciative of the community, but I think figuring out how to navigate it and have it be positive and keep learning and keep coming back is a challenge for us. It's something that we do each week, and it's good.
Do your daughters participate now that they're older? Are they comfortable in your Orthodox synagogue or in your Orthodox home?
They are certainly comfortable in our home. They, I would say, rarely attend services with us, and I think would be comfortable doing so. They're away from home right now, so that's why I'm hesitating a little bit to think it through. They all have a different relationship to their Judaism, which like oscillates between like wildly enthusiastic and quite less enthusiastic in a not so untypical way. And so I think that they too are finding their path through it, trying to understand which parts of it they really are drawn to. And I think our presence in a more Orthodox observant community is both a draw into that community and repulsion away from it.
So I have a question for Adam on this point, because one of the things that I'm so fascinated by for all of these conversations we've had is that it's like the famous line, that Tolstoy wrote, the first line in Anna Karenina. I always mess it up. The one, every family is, what is it? Happy in their own way, unhappy in the same way. Every family has their own mishigas is how he wrote it in Yiddish. But so that they're all unique to that individual, to that family. And there's always something universal. I would love, Adam, maybe you could tease out, because we've made it we've discussed how unique this particular story is, that your, non-Jewish modern Orthodox spouse then became formally, had an Orthodox conversion. So what, Adam, is universal in what we're talking about? I mean, I've heard from other friends who, who either have converted or have their spouses have converted, that it's very often the person who converts who brings the born Jew to become more observant. So is that the universal piece of this, or is there something different that I'm not seeing?
So I want to say I'll ask in true Jewish fashion. I'll answer you by asking Jacob a question, but I'll just say something first. See, there's a second piece of it, and that is that after the New Yorker article, Jeannie became the poster convert, so that everybody knows Jeannie's story. Right, Jacob? I guess now you're used to Jeannie being a celeb. I mean, you're also a celeb. You're just slightly different kinds of celebs. But that also is interesting. So it wasn't like, hey, you just walk down the street and, whatever your story is, but hey, there's Jeannie who wrote the article in the New Yorker about conversion. So that's my first piece. My question is, I know that Cambridge is like the Upper West Side. Everybody's Jewish, whether you're Jewish or not. But I'm wondering, when you're talking a lot about shul and about, insider, outsider, what about socially? Do you feel there's a difference in your social circle? I understand it's not who your friends are, because you're both in Harvard Law School, and I'm sure your friends are from the beginning. But what about just in terms of how you relate to people and how people relate to you, in the last 2 years?
Yeah. So that's interesting. I fear I'm not going to have a good, satisfying answer for it, because we're such excessive homebodies, and so are mostly just at home. And I would say that people have been very interested in the conversion and like wanted to ask about it. That's true of my students. I think they're not sure whether it's okay to ask about or talk about it, but my students do want to talk about it. I think that Jeannie had kind of been supportive of the Orthodox community just because of history anyway, so it was sort of a part of that. So that hasn't been a huge change, I would say. But it was certainly like notable understates to say that she converted. That was a pretty big deal, I would say, in the community. So I think that there was a publicity to it, which sometimes it's a fairly private affair. Maybe it's the family, but it's really a pretty private affair. This was not. This was there was publicity to it. It was not, I think, publicity that she sought out in the sense that she ever really thought, I'll write about this, but like, this is what we do. Like, the way we process the things in our lives is to write them. And so she ended up writing them, and I think it was important to do it that way. I was totally supportive of her doing it that way, and she got to kind of write her story, or a version of her story. And like, in that story, I'm a part of it. It's not my story. It's not really even our story, but I'm a part of that story.
Well, and you're interesting. It's interesting because you're part of the story. Let's just explain to everybody. You're introduced as being Jeannie's partner, Jeannie's husband, but then it's very personal because all of a sudden the discussion about whether or not you're a Kohen becomes important. And that's in the story. And that's really inside baseball.
It's inside baseball. Yes. Yes. So I learned and changed as a result of the story and writing because of this. And so I think, but for me, like having the aspect of our personal life in some sense, like recounted publicly, that it's just different. We are public figures, but the public figures that we are tend to be performative. We're teaching or lecturing. It's a performance. It's a different thing. And so to be really kind of open and honest about something that's deeply personal in that way, that was different for me. And I felt a little anxious about it. I feel kind of happy and proud to be a part of the story at this point. And I don't like there's a sense in which like some people convert for their partner, or for their partner's parents. And that's not what this was. Jeannie didn't convert for me. And in some sense, like our relationship was part of what I think allowed the conversion to be such a positive thing in her life. I think, it's not that it's unrelated to me or our relationship, but one could get like an ego about it. Like, oh, I was the reason, that's just not what it was for us. And so I think like being able to explore that openly, both in the piece and afterward, was really good. And I think it did allow for me to grow as well.
With the podcast is called Your People Will Be My People. But the second part of it that we've talked about is conversion in a post-October 7th world. And so in many ways to have her be so public as a public figure, and both of you, and then to write about the choice, the decision, the desire to become Jewish, to formally become a Jew rather than just be, which there are many, people who are not Jewish but are raising Jewish families. It's very inspiring and it's good PR for the Jews. I mean, the fact that in this moment in time where not only, where there's so much talk and anxiety about being Jewish in the world, in this country and in other countries, to have someone such a public persona to say, I've made this choice, I think is really, I think it's brave just to write about your own life, but I think it's brave and I think it's really additive to the Jewish story. And I think, even more notable and important when we look back on this time and how people felt about being publicly Jewish. I think it's really important about someone who now would choose.
I just to amplify that point, then Jacob, maybe this will be the last your last comment, and that is what I find always so amazing is that October 7th plays a role for Jeannie and played a role in the in the article about listening to the sermon on October 7th. But you're generally speaking, this is why I just wanted to say something because it's about my experience. Generally speaking, the people whom October 7th made a difference for are people who had a connection specifically to Israel. Someone whose partner is Israeli, someone who was in Israel, has relatives in Israel, something around Israel. But even though October 7th played a role for Jeannie, your story is very much an American story. And I think that's really interesting, right? Everything you're describing, back from the small town in Maine to Long Island and to Jeannie's, being married to someone within a modern Orthodox family, and then starting again, and all these things are so American. And I'm sure that would resonated with the New Yorker readers. But I think that's just interesting when you balance October 7th with that experience.
Yes. So I think that's right. It is a very American story, but I will say it also feels very European to me. And just in the sense that, like I did the ancestry.com or, like I'm 100% Eastern European Jew. Like there's nothing else in there, Russia, Poland, Romania, like it's just all of it. And obviously like that community at that point, because of that, was like all Jews, all Jewish. And here it's just so not that. But that sense of like they're coming for us is so deeply like enmeshed in what we're in the psyche. And so I think I always internalize a sense of like, you just keep your head down. That's part of what it is. Practicing or not, you just kind of keep your head down. And something that I've learned from Jeannie, not just in this context, but in many contexts over the years, is that no, sometimes you have to stick your head out and stand up and just sort of be, not like take it all on, but just like live it as you want to live in a way that is you're proud of, and that is in fact public, not attention seeking, but is public so that other people can see it, and your kids can see it, and your friends can see it, and your colleagues can see it. And that has been a change for me. It hasn't been an easy thing to adopt, but it's something that I can see. And the article and the conversion and the way that she decided to talk about it, and the way that you've talked about it is, I think, part of that.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. I'm like getting all verklempt just hearing that. That's really beautiful.
That is an amazing way to to conclude this discussion. You and Jeannie are a remarkable piece of the story of conversion, the story of October 7th, but really exactly what you said, the story of American Jewry, the story. I mean, I don't know, you talk about Eastern Europe. I think about what my great-grandfather in Malava, Poland would think about what I'm doing all the time. And besides the fact that he wouldn't understand it, I just wonder what he would think. I'll just tell you that my great-grandfather, we'll end with a story. He lived in the United States for 40 years. And even at the end of his life, he didn't know how to speak English. And to think that, that those Eastern European great-grandparents refused to become American, and that we can talk about this kind of American embrace of Judaism, really, I think, is a credit to the Jews of America, who really, like you said, it's not always a straight line. It's not always so simple, but it's something that we work really hard on, and that the generation of our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, wherever it will lead them, will be stronger because of these experiences. Thank you, Jacob. Love to Jeannie, and thank you, Meredith. Enjoy DC, and we look forward to the next one.